the Saudis and Emiratis were taking real steps to reduce the risk of harm to civilians and civilian infrastructure resulting from their military operations in Yemen. In the period of time before the certification was due, attacks against civilians rose sharply. According to the International Red Cross, August was the most violent month in 2018 in Yemen, with nearly 500 people killed in just 9 days. Since 2015, the coalition has undertaken 18,000 airstrikes. That's one every 99 minutes if you do the math. Fully one-third of those have hit non-military targets, 1 in 3. This isn't just a statistic. One of those 1 in 3 was a school bus in northern Yemen with 40 children on it. That's not acceptable. So I was stunned, frankly, that in September, the administration certified that the Saudis and Emiratis were indeed taking these steps, these so-called demonstrable actions to reduce civilian deaths. The administration simply could have waived the requirement. The law allowed that, but they didn't. They essentially told us not to believe our eyes. Let me be clear. We have real strategic interests in that part of the world. Iran continues to destabilize the region, and their support for the Houthis is only part of their strategy to bleed their regional adversaries. But I do not support providing assistance that we know is being used to kill civilians. And so if the administration won't demand any sort of accountability from the Saudis and Emiratis, the work then falls to the Congress. The Pentagon cut off refueling as a matter of policy, but that could be reversed at any time. This resolution would cut off refueling as a matter of law. It also sends a clear message to the administration, to our partners in the Gulf, and to our adversaries that Congress won't sit back and shirk our responsibilities when it comes to foreign policy. It's time to have the debates about how, when, and where the U.S. military is engaged around the world. This resolution is sparking that debate. So I will support moving this measure to the floor, and at this time I will yield to the ranking member for any comments he might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a tremendous respect for the chair, but I must say this first markup is I think a departure from the strongly bipartisan cooperation that we've enjoyed on this committee. I believe that this committee does have a solemn responsibility to appropriately exercise congressional war powers under Article 1 of the Constitution. But the mechanism to force withdrawal of U.S. forces under the War Powers Act applies only when we are engaged in live-fire hostilities. This is not the case here. This is not what our military is doing currently in Yemen. This resolution would set a very dangerous precedent. Are we now going to allow any member to use this privileged war powers tool to second-guess all U.S. security cooperation agreements throughout the world? This interpretation could impact our assistance to Israel. It could impact our cooperation with African nations in the Sahel. We could recklessly undo critical security relationships we have spent decades building. This is not what the War Powers Resolution has ever meant, and it should not be used this way now. A vote in favor is a victory for bad policy. As we heard at this morning's hearing, the situation in Yemen poses critical strategic and humanitarian issues that deserve careful attention. If we want to discuss conditioning assistance to Saudi Arabia in this conflict, that is an area we can explore and debate. But this resolution is trying to hammer a square peg into a round hole. It misuses an extraordinary war powers tool to try to get at the issue of security assistance to a third country. Even our aerial refueling of Saudi jets, which does not constitute hostilities as traditionally understood, ended last November. And I spoke with Defense Department representatives yesterday who reaffirmed that U.S. forces are not engaged in hostilities against Houthi forces in Yemen. They confirmed the continuing accuracy of the detailed letter sent to Congress last year by the department's acting general counsel. No one is saying that U.S. security assistance to Saudi Arabia or anyone else is beyond congressional scrutiny. We have many tools to use, including this committee's arms sales notifications targeted legislation, and the annual appropriations process, among others. But this resolution stretches the definition of hostilities to cover non-U.S. military operations by other countries. It reinterprets U.S. support to those countries as engagement in hostility. This has implications far beyond Saudi Arabia. Under this model, if any member of Congress doesn't like something that any of our security partners does overseas, that member can force quick consideration of a resolution directing the removal of U.S. forces from hostilities, quote, in or affecting, unquote, that situation. It no longer matters that U.S. forces are not actually conducting those hostilities. The bill is vague and irresponsible. It will create doubts for our partners and allies around the world. It will trouble the many Americans who believe the burden sharing with capable allies is vital for U.S. national security. And for that reason, I oppose this measure. And Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to place into the record 3 documents. One, the January 2019 Department of Defense report to Congress concerning our similar acquisition and cross-servicing activities with over 117 nations around the world, including our NATO allies, CT partners in the Sahel, Israel, and others. 2, the November 28, 2018 statement of the administration policy opposing SJ Res 54 because, quote, the United States forces are not engaged in hostilities between the Saudi-led coalition and Houthi forces in Yemen, unquote. And third, the February 27, 2018 letter from the Department of Defense Office of General Counsel explaining the legal and security concerns posed by the approach used by today's resolution. I ask unanimous consent to place those in the record.
Without objection, so moved.
And I thank the chairman for that. And again, I oppose this measure, and I yield back my time.
The ranking member yields back. Does any other member seek recognition on the resolution? I'm told Mr. Connolly does.
Thank you,
Connolly.
Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate the juridical distinction made by the ranking member that the United States is not technically involved on the ground in hostilities. But the United States most certainly has been involved in equipping, re-equipping, training, and other support for the Saudi activity in Yemen that has led to one of the greatest humanitarian crises on the face of the planet. And that's what we're trying to address today. We can hide behind juridical language that it's not technically a combat involvement of the United States, but it begs the question. Since 2015, the United States has provided support to the Saudi-led coalition in its war against Houthi rebels in Yemen. In addition to claiming an estimated 60,000 Yemeni lives, this war is fueling the world's largest humanitarian crisis. Humanitarian agencies now estimate that 85,000 children have died from malnutrition. More than half the population currently requires emergency food assistance, and 1 in every 10 Yemeni children has been forcibly displaced from his or her home due to this conflict. In 2017, in September 2018, Secretary Pompeo certified to this Congress that the Saudi and Emirati governments were mitigating harm to civilians and civilian infrastructure in Yemen. Meanwhile, the Saudi-led coalition has conducted attacks, killing dozens of civilians at a time, often with U.S.-provided munitions, belying the certification made in September of 2018. Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution states unequivocally, Congress shall have the power to declare war and to raise and support armies and other armed forces. I would argue, just as the executive branch says there are implied powers in the role of commander-in-chief, certainly there are implied powers about our ability to stop military interventions as we deem fit. Article 1 says so, as far as I'm concerned. Pursuant to the War Powers Resolution, PL 93-148, The President must remove U.S. armed forces engaged in hostilities outside U.S. territory without a specific statutory authorization if Congress so directs. And I would argue that that's a broad authority for Congress. It doesn't necessarily mean U.S. combat troops on the ground. Support for ongoing hostilities by a third power, an ally, certainly qualify as far as I am concerned.
With the gentleman lead, we're concerned that there's time running out. There's 37 seconds left. So
I support the resolution in front of us. I believe Congress needs to reclaim its congressional power, and I will vote for the resolution pending before this committee. I thank the chair.
I thank the gentleman. The committee will now recess until after votes on the floor. The committee stands in recess.
Or, sorry, I guess to the right. Basically down next to James.
think people are making statements as well. Not mandatory, but
Let me ask.
that's what the staff told me.
Okay. Let me figure out the order.
I assume it's the usual.
Is that something that you want to do?
I mean, I'll feel it out, but if it feels right, then who am I to say no?
I went back looking for hot tea, but they're out of hot water, so I struck out there. I'm looking for caffeine desperately.
The committee will come back to order. For those who weren't here, before we broke, I gave my opening statement, and the ranking member gave his opening statement, and then Mr. Connolly of Virginia gave a statement. So we can now call on any other members seeking recognition. First, we'll start from the Republican side. Anybody seeking recognition?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate that the Foreign Affairs Committee has always had a strongly bipartisan cooperation to work on issues that are so important to the American people. I believe that the committee has a solemn responsibility to appropriately exercise the Congressional War Powers Act under Article 1 of the Constitution, but the mechanism to force withdrawal of U.S. forces under the War Powers Act applies only when we are engaged in live fire hostilities. This is not what our military is currently doing in its operations and support of operations in Yemen. This resolution would set a very dangerous precedent, as we are now going to allow any member to use this privileged war powers tool to second-guess all U.S. security cooperation agreements throughout the world. This interpretation could impact our assistance to Israel. It would impact our cooperation with African countries in the Sahel. It would recklessly undo critical security relationships we've spent decades building. This is not what the War Powers Resolution was ever meant, and it should not be used in this way. A vote in favor is a victory for bad politics. As we have heard at this morning's hearing, the situation in Yemen poses critical strategic and humanitarian issues that deserve careful attention. If we want to discuss conditioning assistance to Saudi Arabia in this conflict, that is the area that we need to explore and debate. But this resolution is trying to hammer a square peg into a round hole. It misuses the extraordinary war powers tool to try to get to the issue of security assistance to a third country. This, even of our refueling of Saudi jets, which does not constitute hostilities as traditionally understood, ended last November. I spoke with the Department of Defense representatives yesterday who reaffirmed the U.S. forces are not engaged in hostilities against the Houthi forces in Yemen. They confirmed the continuing accuracy of the detailed letter sent to Congress last year by the Department's acting General Counsel. No one is saying that U.S. security assistance to Saudi Arabia or anyone else is beyond congressional scrutiny. We have many tools to use, including the committee's arms sales notifications, targeted legislation, and the annual appropriations process, among others. But this resolution stretches the definition of hostilities to cover non-U.S. military operations by other countries. It reiterates and reinterprets U.S. support to these countries as engagement in hostilities. This has implications far beyond Saudi Arabia. Under this model, if any member of Congress doesn't like something that any of our security partners conducts overseas, that member can force quick consideration of a resolution directing the removal of U.S. forces from hostilities, quote, in or on affecting, end of quote, that situation. It no longer matters that the U.S. forces are not actually conducting the hostilities. This bill is vague and irresponsible. It will create doubts for our partners and allies around the world. It will trouble the many Americans who believe that burden sharing with capable allies is vital for U.S. security to protect American families. For these reasons, I strongly oppose this measure. I yield back my time.
Are there any other members seeking recognition? Mr. Deutsch?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm grateful to you for moving quickly to give this committee the opportunity to advance debate on U.S. involvement in the Yemen conflict. It is a debate that is long overdue. As we just heard earlier today, U.S. presence in the Arabian Peninsula and our relationships with regional states are vital to stability in the Middle East. These ties are enduring and date to the end of the Second World War. We should be clear from the outset that we value our alliances and we do share common interests. But we should be honest in reassessing where those interests diverge and in identifying actions that set back our mutual objectives. First and foremost, we've got to view our relationship with regional states through the prism of our own interests. Where do our priorities align? What types of action undermine our own goals? The Saudis and Emiratis are preoccupied with their campaign in Yemen, which they see as a direct threat to their national security. The U.S. is right to support these countries' right to self-defense and shares the concern that Iran is assisting the Houthis to further its own regional ambitions. But I also remain deeply troubled by the protracted military campaign in Yemen. The number of civilian casualties is alarming, to say the least. The lack of humanitarian access that has fostered famine and other extreme conditions and has put tens of millions of people at risk of starvation and disease is creating the worst crisis in decades. And I fear that the United States, through our coalition support, may be furthering the suffering and helping to perpetuate a conflict that has no military solution. The coalition war against the Houthis also redirects attention away from al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, the most dangerous branch of al-Qaeda, and one that has sought to attack the United States directly. In fact, public reporting has indicated these very groups the U.S. has long targeted in Yemen have at times been empowered by our own allies. Numerous reports of the use of child soldiers on both sides, illegal detention centers, shadow mercenaries, and continued reckless targeting should at least give us pause to re-examine exactly what role we should play in this conflict. That's why I'm an original co-sponsor of HJ Res 37. That's why I will vote in support of it today. For too long, this Congress has abdicated its role in foreign policy. Last Congress, procedural moves were made to prevent us from even having this debate. The Trump administration, our Saudi and Emirati partners, the Houthis and their Iranian backers must know that the status quo is unacceptable and must take greater steps to reach a diplomatic settlement to end the war. The administration has only been willing to stand up for U.S. principles when there is sustained pressure by Congress, as we saw with the suspension of refueling. It is time for accountability. The world must know the United States does not accept and cannot be complicit in the deaths of innocent civilians in Yemen. Being an ally does not mean being given free rein, and we must ensure that we are supporting our partners in making decisions that are in our best interest. I look forward to continuing this debate with my colleagues on the House floor, and I look forward to ensuring that our policies in the Middle East are also protecting U.S. security interests. And I appreciate, Mr. Chairman, the opportunity to speak on this and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Deutsch. Mr. Kinzinger.
Mr. Chairman, I can pass on my opening statement if there's nobody else. Otherwise, I'll speak.
I think Mr. Curtis, I think, wanted to speak.
Yeah, go ahead.
Mr. Curtis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member McCall, for giving me a brief moment to speak regarding House Joint Resolution 37, directing the removal of U.S. armed forces from hostilities in Yemen. To be clear, I support the intent of the resolution. I've spoken often, including on the House floor, regarding my concerns with the U.S. involvement in Yemen's civil war. This is one of the world's deadliest wars that has killed tens of thousands of civilians. It is horrific, a horrific humanitarian crisis. An estimated 85,000 children have been killed or died of malnutrition and disease. The time has come for the U.S. to reconsider our support of this disastrous war and to consider the moral imperatives that form the foundation of our values and strategic interest. It is my fear that our continued support of the Saudi-led coalition's effort in Yemen will only increase resentment of the United States in the region and could diminish America's reputation as a champion of human rights and civil liberties. Aside from the gross inhumanity of this war, I have growing concerns about the behavior of Saudi Arabia as it affects our larger American strategic interest in the region and our interest in preserving global humanitarian norms. With all of that said, I will be voting no on the resolution before the committee today. My concerns are with the way the resolution is written, and I believe it is the wrong vehicle to achieve the objective. I believe that the resolution distorts the war powers tool to address the situation in Yemen. It is my concern that this resolution could set a dangerous precedent and would have the unintended consequences of complicating U.S. security cooperation with partners around the world. And for those reasons, I oppose the resolution. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield my time.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Liu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yemen is not and should not be a partisan issue. As all of you know, U.S. assistance to Saudi-led coalition started under the Obama administration. In September 2015, I wrote a letter to the Pentagon about this then little-known war in Yemen because we were seeing reports that the Saudi-led coalition was striking innocent civilians. In the following months and years, more and more Democrats as well as Republicans started to get involved. And it's not just the humanitarian catastrophe we're concerned about, it is war crimes. And regardless of what your view is of Saudi Arabia or our relationship, we cannot be assisting a coalition that's engaging in war crimes. We also know, based on years of looking at the activity, it's not as if the Saudi jets are trying to hit a moving Houthi target and they miss and they strike a bunch of civilians. What they're doing is they're precisely trying to strike the civilians. They have intentionally hit schools, wedding parties, funerals, most recently a bus with over 40 school kids. And that's why I support this resolution. I do note that some of my Republican colleagues do have concerns related to war powers. That's why Representative Malinowski, Yoho, and I also introduced a simple clean bill that just tells us to get out of Yemen, and the Armed Services Committee will have jurisdiction over that. Having said that, I support this resolution, and I urge people to support it as well.
Thank you. Does any other member seek recognition? If not, we can go to an immediate vote. Mr. Kinzinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I did change my mind because there was more discussion than I thought. So thank you for this opportunity to address this again. Mr. Chairman, I respect the intention of everybody to try to get to the solution. I respect the fact that everybody has compassion for what's going on in Yemen, as we all should. I'm going to make the point that I made earlier today, which I think is very important to make before I make a few other points. The vast majority, or at least a significant number of people that are on this committee are freshmen. The freshmen on this committee have not had an opportunity to be briefed by the administration on what is going on in Yemen and what we are doing in Yemen. The reason many people that are supporting this and voting for this without being briefed in a skiff about what's going on in Yemen and I hate to say this because I love this committee, but it's political. It's because back home, the Yemen war is all over Twitter, and because there's pressure, so we want to just pass this thing out of here. I mean, I love the hearing we did earlier. That's important. But for the very first action of this committee to be to pass a war powers resolution that has nothing to do with what the war powers resolution was intended to do, the fact that there's over 100 agreements between the Department of Defense and other countries that this, if passed, would now open up for any member of Congress who disagrees with any one of those cooperation agreements to do the same exact thing. Let's say we have a member of this committee or of Congress that doesn't like our engagement with Israel. By the way, I noticed that in this resolution it says none of this shall be construed to hurt our cooperation with Israel. Well, that's true. It also is not construed for our cooperation with Georgia or the Puppy Brigade or anybody, because this is specifically about Yemen. The point about Israel is this opens up that opportunity now for any member to come forward and say they disagree with our military cooperation with Israel and do a privileged resolution and force a vote on the floor. In the country of Georgia, where a third of it is occupied by Russian forces, we have cooperation with that nation. Now, anybody that is pro-Russian can come forward and say that we need to debate ending cooperation with the Georgian military and everything else. Look, if you vote for this, I don't think you're a bad person, trust me. I don't think you have America's interests not at your heart. But my request of this committee, if we're gonna take up this resolution, is let's all have really good discussions about it. Let's have information in the skiff about what we're really doing over there. Let's have a detailed discussion about what happens if we pull out all cooperation of Saudi Arabia, and what does that look like in terms of targeting in Yemen, and go through what we need, and then as a committee, we can have this vote. But Mr. Chairman, respectfully, and I have a great deal of respect for you, this is our very first committee action, and we're getting ready to take an action that is going to have detrimental consequences without really thinking it through. So I have a great deal of respect here for all of my colleagues, but I would beg you to think through what your vote would have. I get the political implications of this. I get that Saudi Arabia, for instance, is a hot topic right now in the political sphere. But what we do on this committee is not about politics. There's always some of that, we get it. What I have loved about being on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and the reason I have fought hard to get my waivers to be on this committee, is because this is a committee that puts partisan politics, for the most part, in front or behind what is good for this nation. And if you all think decision after having all the information in front of you before just saying the very first meeting of this committee, let's have a vote that could have a massive impact, open up over 100 defense agreements for any other member of the House of Representatives that takes a problem with that to debate and bring a privileged resolution. So with all due respect, I would beg you to vote against this. I would beg the majority to pull this resolution, but if they don't pull it, I would beg you to vote against it. Let's get briefings, let's move on, and then have a really good debate and vote after that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Malinowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I very much appreciate the sentiment that was just expressed and the passion behind it. With respect, I am a freshman who has spent many, many hours in SCIFs looking at this situation, having helped to oversee some of our assistance to Saudi Arabia in this conflict. We have a number of freshman members here who have significant national security experience. So I think we should debate the substance of this rather than suggest that any of us on this side have not thoroughly studied the question. For me, look, many of us on both sides have concerns about our engagement with Saudi Arabia. I share some of my Republican colleagues' concerns about not overusing the war powers resolution. I think there may be other ways to address these concerns, and as Mr. Liu mentioned, we hope to be able to work together with you on that. But the question here before us is a very simple one. Are we actually involved in active hostilities with the Saudis in Yemen? I can tell you most of my former colleagues in the State Department who were lawyers looking at this question believed that the answer to it was yes. And I think it stands to reason. Imagine, if you will, if a foreign power were engaged in airstrikes against Washington, D.C. as we spoke, and a second foreign power was refueling its aircraft over the Chesapeake Bay and then servicing those aircraft when they landed to stock up on bombs again so that they could resume their operations against us. Would we consider the second power to be engaged in active hostilities against us? I think all of us in this room would say yes. We are deeply, deeply embedded in the Saudi conflict in Saudi Arabia in a way that we are not in the various partnership relationships we have in Africa, in the Middle East, that my friend fears that this will implicate. I think the standard we are setting here for defining engagement in active hostilities is in fact very, very high, very, very appropriate, and I will be voting for this resolution as a result. Thank you.
Would my friend yield for a question? Mr. Melanos?
Yes, absolutely.
Would my friend agree, in addition to the points he made, that we're arguing over what constitutes combat and hostilities, and that the support we've been giving in the Yemen conflict to the Saudis would clearly fall within the penumbra of hostilities and combat support involving U.S. military, if not on the ground?
I would say yes, and in a way that's distinct from most of our partner relationships around the world. The provision of weapons to Saudi Arabia, in my mind, would not rise to that level.
And would my
But
friend...
refueling operations, targeting where we are actually there with them, selecting the target and enabling the aircraft to reach the target, if this was being done to us, there's no question in my mind that we would agree that that would be hostilities against the United States.
So, if I'm not finished yet, if my friend would further yield.
Of course, yes.
So I understand that there are differences in approach, and that some have a juridical approach, which is that, strictly speaking, unless there are boots on the ground, we're not in combat, and this doesn't apply, and we're overreaching. I beg to differ, as obviously does my friend from New Jersey. But let me ask one final question. Would my friend also agree that just as there are implied powers for the role of the commander-in-chief that over the years have really been expanded, that there are also implied powers in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution exclusively granting to the legislative branch the power of war and peace and the assembling of armed forces. That's explicit language in the Constitution of the United States. And that today, we are, in fact, you could disagree with the action, but certainly you can't argue constitutionally that we're not within our right to circumscribe the involvement of U.S. military when we have grave doubts on behalf of the people we represent.
I certainly agree with my friend, and it's a responsibility that Congress over the years has arguably abdicated. And I think one of the points of this resolution and our broader efforts on Saudi Arabia, however we approach them, is to assert that Congress has that role and responsibility. Obviously, we need to exercise it responsibly, but I think we're doing so here.
Time is up. Anybody on the Republican side wish to be heard? If not, we have one more on. Mr. Zeldin.
I yield to Mr. Kinzinger.
Thank you, Mr. Zeldin. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not going to take all 5 minutes. I do want to make a point, though. If the United States government was overthrown by a terrorist organization and somebody was bombing that terrorist organization and there was a country refueling and giving them targeting against the terrorist organization, I certainly wouldn't consider them an enemy. I think that's an important point to make. And again, I think just because I don't want to take all 5 minutes, one of the biggest things here is, what precedent are we setting in any one of our defense cooperation agreements by this? I respect, sir, gentleman from New Jersey, that you do know what's going on. I would argue that there are a lot of people that just don't. And that's not a cut to them. There's probably situations around the world I don't know anything about because I haven't been briefed to the level I should have been. And I got to tell you, and this is dead honest, and my friends on the other side of the aisle know this about me, if my party in 2015 was bringing this up against President Obama, who began this cooperation, I would be saying the exact words I'm saying today, and I would be opposing my own party in this resolution because I think it's so bad. With that, I'll yield back to gentlemen.
I yield back to the chair.
Thank you, Ms. Spanberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To comment on the positions put forth by my colleague from Illinois, I would like to position that we, in fact, are making informed decisions. That's the focus of what we're doing here. And I can think of no better first action than one that is focused on Article 1 of the Constitution that requires that members of Congress make informed decisions about hostile engagement that, in fact, we undergo. And my colleague's reverse hypothetical of my colleague from New Jersey's position was actually not one that was something that we can perceive as a comparison, because in fact, the minute we start changing under which circumstances we're willing to abdicate our responsibility related to Article 1, in the case of a government overthrow, does Congress just step back and let the administration or the executive branch do whatever they want? In this circumstance or that circumstance, we are taking away and we are abdicating our responsibility as members of Congress. And the minute we engage in these hypotheticals where we are talking about different circumstances and allowing for and justifying behaviors in different circumstances, I think that's where we get into challenging territory. And so I will be supporting this resolution today because I think it is absolutely because we need to make informed decisions that Congress should be engaged on where it is that we are, in fact, engaged in hostile activity or military activity. I yield back. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Hearing no further requests for recognition, the question is to report House Joint Resolution 37 to the House with the recommendation that the bill does pass. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Sherman? Mr. Sherman? Mr. Meeks? Mr. Meeks? Mr. Siras? Mr. Siras votes aye. Mr. Connolly?
Aye.
Mr. Connolly votes aye. Mr. Deutsch? Mr. Deutsch votes aye. Ms. Bass? Ms. Bass votes aye. Mr. Keating? Mr. Keating votes aye. Mr. Cicilline? Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Barra? Mr. Barra votes aye. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes aye. Ms. Titus? Ms. Titus votes aye. Mr. Espaillat? Mr. Espaillat? Mr. Liu? Mr. Liu votes aye. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes aye. Mr. Phillips? Mr. Phillips votes aye. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes aye. Mr. Allred?
Aye.
Mr. Allred votes aye. Mr. Levin?
Aye.
Mr. Levin votes aye. Ms. Spanberger? Ms. Spanberger votes aye. Ms. Houlihan? Ms. Houlihan votes aye. Mr. Malinowski? Mr. Malinowski votes aye. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes aye. Mr. Costa? Mr. Costa votes aye. Mr. Vargas? Mr. Vargas votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Gonzalez votes aye. Mr. McCall?
No.
Mr. McCall votes no. Mr. Smith? No. Mr. Smith votes no. Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Wilson? No. Mr. Wilson votes no. Mr. Perry? Mr. Perry votes no. Mr. Yoho? No. Mr. Yoho votes no. Mr. Kinzinger? Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Zeldin? Mr. Zeldin votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mrs. Wagner? No. Mrs. Wagner votes no. Mr. Mast? Mr. Mast votes no. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Rooney? Mr. Fitzpatrick? Mr. Fitzpatrick votes no. Mr. Curtis? Mr. Curtis votes no. Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck? Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes no. Mr. Rushton-Holler? Mr. Rushton-Holler votes no. Mr. Burchett? Mr. Burchett votes no. Mr. Pence? Mr. Pence votes no. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes no. Mr. Guest? Mr. Guest votes no.
May I ask the clerk how
Chairman Engel.
votes aye.
Chairman Engel votes aye.
Oh,
Sorry, Mr. Espion has entered.
Mr. Espiat? Mr.
Mr. Espiat votes aye.
Have all members been recorded? Okay, the clerk will report. One more?
Is Mr. Sherman recorded?
Is Mr. Sherman recorded?
Mr. Sherman votes aye.
I've had my staff do that before. I do vote aye, yes.
What'd they do? What'd she do?
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 25 ayes and 17 noes.
25 ayes and 17 noes. The ayes have it. The measure is ordered favorably reported, and the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table without objection. The staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes, and this concludes our business today. I want to thank Mr. McCall and all our members on both sides of the aisle, and the committee stands adjourned.
All right, first markup.
First markup went smoothly.
Not too many
Now we
fireworks.
can agree on everything
No one
else.
screamed.
It was the procedure, it was the roll call that was the most interesting
The roll
part of
call
it.
was kind of
A little dicey.